Hilchos Shabbos, Perek Shisha ve'esrim. The laws of Shabbos, chapter 26. Today we continue the halachot of Muktzeh. The idea that the sages decreed that even though it doesn't look like work and it won't bring you to work, there are certain utensils that should not be moved or touched on the Shabbos. And there are other utensils that may be moved on the Shabbos only under certain conditions, only for certain purposes. We talked yesterday about the kli shemalachto leheter and the kli shemalachto leisur. Utensils that their primary purpose is something which is permitted on Shabbos, and utensils whose primary purpose is something forbidden on the Shabbos. And the different types of ways you might use or move both of those types of kelim. And the Rambam continues the discussion today with other utensils that go into either of these categories or general rules related to Muktzeh. So here we go. Halacha Aleph. Kol klei ha'oreg v'chabalav v'kanim shelo. All utensils of a weaver and his ropes and his sticks or the reeds that he uses, mutar letaltalan ki kli shemalachto leisur. You're allowed to move them like you're allowed to move a vessel that's used for something that's forbidden. Chutz mikoved ha'elyon v'koved ha'tachton. Except for the two heavy beams at the top and the bottom of the loom. Lefi she'en nitalin mipnei shehin tkuin. Because you don't move them because they're stuck into the pillars that hold them up. This is on the screen. You have the picture of the primitive loom that we brought up a couple of chapters ago when we talked about the malacha of weaving. And the idea being that the loom would get wrapped around two beams. This is called the koved ha'elyon and the koved ha'tachton. You'd wrap the warp threads this way, going through the heddles, the frames, and then as you lifted the frames alternately, the woof, the erev, would go through on this way and you'd come up with the cloth. Now, even though you don't see it in this picture, these two, beams are stuck into pillars that are stuck into the ground. That's what's holding up the loom. So the Rambam says, any other part of the weaving process can be moved. They're all utensils that are used for something forbidden on the Shabbos. Weaving is forbidden on Shabbos. But because they can move around, you can treat them like a kli shemalachto leisur, which, as we learned yesterday, you only move for tzorech gufo, to make use of it for a permitted thing, or tzorech mikomo, to make use of the place. But tzorech atzmo, to protect it, you cannot move these stuff for. But everything in the weaver's loom would go into that, except for the koved ha'elyon and the koved ha'tachton, because these two, as the Rambam says, they don't move because they're stuck into the ground, i.e. into the pillars that are stuck into the ground. V'chein ha'amudim shal oreg, that's what he's talking about over here. The actual pillars that are holding it up on the ground, asur l'taltalan, you cannot move those. Shema yitaken ha'gumot shalahen. The sages were worried that if you lift them up out of the ground, there's going to be a hole created in the ground, and you're going to come to flatten it, to level it, and that's forbidden on account of choresh, that's like plowing, as we saw in chapter 21. Ush'ar klei ha'oreg, any other of the weaver's utensils, mutarin, are totally permitted to be moved. Halacha bet, machbedot shel tmara v'chayotze bahen, brooms made out of palm branches, shemechabdin bahen et karka, which are used for sweeping the floor, they're treated like a utensil which its primary use is permitted. Sharei mutar lechabed b'Shabbat. There's no problem with sweeping a floor on Shabbos. There's a problem with sweeping the earthen floor on Shabbos, but not a regular floor. So therefore, if you have these brooms, you can move them on the Shabbos. Livenim shenisharu min habinyan. If you have a bunch of bricks left over at a construction site from a building, harehin ki kli shemalachto leheter, we treat them like a utensil whose normal use is for something permitted on Shabbos, mipnei sheru'uyin lahasev alehen, because you're able to literally recline on them. Sharei shafinotam u'metakninotam, bricks, unlike raw natural stones, are smoothed down, they're fixed into a certain shape, and so you can use them on the Shabbos. V'im tzavarotam, but if you pile them up and put them away for construction purposes, harei hiktzam, then you've set them aside, you've made them muktzeh, ve'asur l'taltalam, and you cannot move them. By stones, it was the opposite. When you had a pile of raw stones, you had to actively prepare them to be used on the Shabbos. By default, they weren't allowed to be used. But here by bricks, because they are smoothed down and in a way are more fit for human purposes, by default, they're allowed to be moved on Shabbos. Only if you put them aside, then you can't move them on Shabbos. Halacha gimel cheres ktana, a small piece of pottery. Mutar letaltala afilu b'rshut harabim, can be carried even in the public domain, of course, provided you stay within your 4 cubits. The point is you can move it. It's not muktzeh. Because it has a use. If it was in a courtyard, you could use it to cover a small vessel. Megufat chavit shenitkatata, a cover of a barrel which was cut into pieces. Hi ushvareha mutar letaltala. It and its broken pieces are allowed to be moved because they can also serve as some kind of a cover. But if you threw it to the garbage while it was still day before Shabbos, asur letaltala, then you cannot move it because you've declared that you don't want it anymore. Klisha nitro ea, a vessel that cracked. That's how the commentary is explained, like you have it on the left. It's still whole, but it's basically cracked. Lo yitlosh mimenu cheres lechasot ba o lismoch ba. Don't pull out a pottery shard to use it to cover something else or to lean to support something else. As it's still a vessel, it's leave it as is. Don't try to do anything with it. Halacha Dalid. This halacha relates more in times of old, where people used to use. They didn't have toilet paper. The way they would wipe themselves with natural stuff, typically with stones, and there were certain types of stones that were better for this use. It says the Rambam mutar lahachnis lebet hakisei shalosh avanim mikurzalot lekaneach behen. You're allowed to bring with you into the bathroom 3 mikurzalot, either means rounded or sharp stones, special wiping stones, to be able to clean yourself with them. And the idea here is that they're not muktzeh. The kama shiuran, how big may these stones be? Kim lo hayad, the size to fill a hand. But if it's a clod of earth that is very crumbly, asur letaltala lekaneach, but you cannot move it to wipe with it because we assume that it's not gonna last. Umutar lahalot avanim lagag lekaneach ben. You can also bring with you stones to a roof to wipe yourself with them. Yardu alehen gshamim v'nishtaku betit. If rain falls on these stones and they got sunk in the mud, like you see here on the right, imri shuman nikar. If their mark is clear, mutar letatel, you can move them out. But if they sunk in, then you cannot take them back out. If you see a stone with filth on it, with dirt on it, so you know that it was used for cleaning, mutar letaltala, you can move it on the Shabbos, va'afilu hi gdola, even if it's big, because it's already been clearly set aside for use in the bathroom. Halacha he haya lefanav tzror v'cheres. If you have a pebble or a pottery shard, mekaneach batzror, better use the pebble to wipe yourself. But if the pottery shard was from a handle of a vessel, so it's smoother, mekaneach b'cheres, then use the pottery shard. Hayu lefanav tzror v'asavim. If you had a pebble or grass, im hayu asavim rakim. If the grass were soft, mekaneach b'hen, use them. If they were rough, they'll probably be more hurtful, and therefore mekaneach batzror, better use the pebble to wipe yourself. Remnants of mats that got worn out. We treat them like a vessel whose primary purpose is permitted on the Shabbos, because they're fit to be used to cover filth. Remnants of cloth which wore out, and they don't even have a size of 3 by 3 finger breadths, in which case they're not even fit to contract ritual impurity. They have no legal importance. Asur letaltalan, you cannot move them. She'enan re'uyin lo la'aniyim v'lo la'ashirim. Nobody would use a piece of cloth that small, poor or rich. Shivrei hatanur, broken pieces of an oven, mutar letaltalan, you can move them. V'hareihim kechol ha'kelim shemalachtan leheter, they're considered like any other utensil whose primary use is permitted on the Shabbos. Kirasha nishmeta achat me'archotea, if you have a range, one of its legs slipped out, asur letaltala, you cannot move it, shema yitka, because that might lead you to firmly put it back in, which is a derivative of boneh. It's a rabbinic prohibition against building to stick something firmly into place. Halacha zayin sulam shel aliyah, a ladder which is used to get you to the second story of a home, asur letaltalo, cannot be moved. She'en alav torat kli, it doesn't have a utensil purpose. It's meant to be stable in one place. That's where it's meant to stay, not meant to be moved. V'shel shovach, but if you have a ladder leading to a birdhouse, mutar lehatoto, you can lean it, move it around. Avolo yolichom mishovach leshovach, but do not move it from one birdhouse to the other. Shelo ya'aseh kederech shu aseh b'chol v'yavo latzud. So you don't do things the way you usually do during the weekday, which actually might lead you to trapping one of the doves, which is actually a biblical prohibition, one of the 39 primary categories of labor. Kanesha moskin ba'azetim, a reed which is used in the process of harvesting olives. Im yesh alav torat kli, if it has a legal status of a utensil, it's treated like a utensil whose primary purpose on Shabbos is forbidden, and it can be moved under those circumstances. A reed that was used by, or was prepared, was designated by a homeowner to open and lock doors. The commentaries say it means a door stopper, essentially. Im yesh torat kli alav, if it has a legal status of a utensil, this is treated like a utensil whose primary purpose is permitted on Shabbos, because unlocking a lock, stopping a door, is not problematic at all on Shabbos. A door which used to have a hinge or a pivot, even though right now it no longer has that hinge. Now you're using this door to simply block off access to a place which was typically not accessed. The word muktzeh in its literal sense over here means a set-aside place. Nobody goes there typically. V'hi nigreret, it's a door that, this type of door that you're using to block, you drag it. You take it, you block the door with it. V'chein chadakim, Shesotmin bahen hapirtza. The same thing if you're talking about, they have here, say, brambles, different types of thorns. You're using to stuff an open space, v'chein machzelet hanigreret, or a mat that drags on the floor. Bizman shekshurin utluyin bakotel, if the door or the mat or whatever it is tied to the wall, sotmin bahen v'noalin bahem. Even if you have to drag it in order to close the opening, you can use it to open and lock these spaces. But if they're not attached to the door, you cannot use them to lock these open spaces. But if these doors were not dragged on the ground, they were hanging, they were above ground, then either way, you can use them to lock and to cover these spaces. If you have a door made out of one board, you take it out and you lock it with. In other words, it's not a swivel door, it's just a board. You put it in the space. If it did not have a threshold under it, something like that, which would show that it's a utensil meant to use for locking, you actually cannot lock with it on the Shabbos. But if on the bottom there's some kind of a threshold, you can use this door to lock that open doorway. If you have a bolt, they used to use these bolts to kind of lock the doors, as some doors still have today, and at the edge there's a bulb, which will show that it's meant to use for locking and it's not a beam like any other beam. If it didn't have a bulb at the end, then you can just assume maybe it's just another wooden beam. But now that it has a bulb, it shows that it's for locking. You can use it on the Shabbos to lock. However, if you have a bolt that has no bulb at the end, if it was attached and tied and hanging on the door, you can use it to lock the door. The truth is, even if it's movable, so long as it's moved typically with its rope, then you can move it on the Shabbos. But if the rope that it's attached to was stuck to the door, and only the bolt was moved like a regular beam, you would put it in the corner. And you go back and lock it when you use it to lock when you want. Since it has no bulb at the end, it only looks like a piece of wood, you cannot use it on Shabbos to lock the door. It has no legal status of a utensil. It's not tied to the wall. It doesn't even have a knot attached to it that would show that it's meant for locking. It has nothing. You look at it, you see a wooden piece. Therefore, you cannot use it on the Shabbos. If you have a candelabra made up of many parts, whether it's big or small, you cannot move it, because you might put it together on Shabbos, which would lead you to firmly insert one part to the other, which is like boneh. The rabbis decreed against doing that. If there was simply grooves in the candelabra, it just looks like it's made out of parts. If it's very big, it requires two hands to move it. You cannot move it. Some texts add in the words here, mipnei kovda, because it's heavy. But most commentaries delete that. It's forbidden. If it's big, it's forbidden to move, because it looks like it has parts. But if it was smaller than that, mutar l'taltala, carrying it, moving it is permitted. A shoe that's on the block, on the mold of the shoemaker, shomtinoto b'Shabbat, you can pull it off on the Shabbos. Fascinatingly, the commentaries explain it's like a kli, shemalachtoli isur. The shoemaker's block is obviously a utensil that's used for forbidden things on Shabbos. You can't make shoes on the Shabbos. But you're allowed to move a kli shemalachtoli isur tzorech mikomo, for the space that it occupies. So in this case, you're allowed to pull the shoe off the block because you need the space inside the shoe. So the fact that you're touching and moving the kli shemalachtoli isur is no problem because you need the space of the shoe. Machbeh shel ba'alei batim. The clothes press. They used to have, stones that would press clothes, an ancient way of an older way of doing what we have today in modern presses, and you would kind of press two heavy weights against each other and you would close it, fasten it closed. So if it's a regular homeowner's press, matirin, you can untie it on the Shabbos, avolo kovshin, but you cannot press it. V'shel kovsin, if it's a launderer's, a professional press, lo yigabo, don't touch it, mipnei shu muktzeh mechamat chisaron kis. It goes into the category of what we saw yesterday, things that are set aside not to be used because of the financial loss that it might cause. It's so expensive, you don't want to touch it, so it's muktzeh on the Shabbos because of chisaron kis. The same thing is with wool shearings. You don't move them on Shabbos because you're particular about them. Of course, if you designated it to be used, then you can use it on Shabbos. Unprocessed hides, you can move them on Shabbos, whether they belong to a homeowner or to a professional. Because nobody is really particular about them, and they're not muktzeh for that reason. Halacha Yud Gimel kol davar metunaf, anything filthy. Going to the v'ki, v'tzoa, v'chayotze bahen, feces, vomit, excrement, something like that. Im hayu bechatzer sheyoshvin ba, if they're sitting in the courtyard where you're sitting on Shabbos, mutar lehotzian la'ashpa or lebet hakiseh, you can take it out to the garbage or to the bathroom. V'zeo hanikra graf shel re'i, that's called in Jewish law a chamber pot. A chamber pot means any presence of filth that's in front of you in the area where you're sitting. But if you're in a different courtyard and the dirt is in a different courtyard, you can simply cover it with a utensil or a vessel, so a child shouldn't go out and get himself dirty, but you cannot move them from their place. Spit on the ground, you can step on it as you're walking and keep going. You can move a pan because of the ash that's in it, even if there are wood chips also in the pan. Because this pan with ash is considered like a chamber pot. It has a disgusting presence and people don't want it in front of them. However, on Shabbos, we don't have the license to create this chamber pot of filth. You can't bring about a situation where there's going to be filth here and now you're going to have to move it. But if it was created on its own or you transgressed and made it, you always have the license to move it away. You began the process of an olive press before Shabbos, and during Shabbos more oil is oozing out from under the beam of the olive press. Dates and almonds that are prepared for merchandise, you can move them and eat them on the Shabbos, this oil and this date and almonds. Even a storehouse of grain, or grain sitting in a pile, you can begin to use it on Shabbos. It isn't considered to be muktzeh. No food is considered muktzeh on the Shabbos. Everything is considered to be prepared and ready to be used on Shabbos, with the exception of two things: dried figs and raisins that are sitting in the backyard while you're drying them. Since in the drying process they go through a stage where they become sort of rotten, spoiled, and you cannot eat them, then they remain forbidden on the entire Shabbos because they're muktzeh. A barrel of liquid that was left open all night, or a watermelon that was opened, even though they can no longer be eaten. There was a fear in those days of venomous snakes coming into these things and taking a bite from them, and you would stay away from such liquid or such watermelon from eating them. You can move them and put them in a hidden place. Something similar to this. An amulet that has no proven efficacy, it wasn't coming from an expert, even though you cannot carry it on Shabbos outside, you can move it. Leftover oil in a lamp or in a bowl, and it had been lit on that Shabbos, cannot be used on that Shabbos. It goes into the category of something which is muktzeh because it was associated with a prohibition, as we saw yesterday. In a storehouse of grain or of wine barrels, even though you can begin to use it on Shabbos for your personal needs. To clear it out, you cannot do only if it's for a mitzvah. To bring in guests or to have a shiur there, a study hall. When you do clear a storehouse for a mitzvah, how do you go about clearing it? Every person should fill up 4 or 5 boxes until they finish. As we explained in chapter 21, you cannot clear out the entire floor of the storehouse because that might lead you to level the earthen floor when you'll see there's some uneven spaces. You go in and you go out. If you want, you can make a path with your feet as you walk in and out, step on the ground and create a little path. That's fine, but not to fully clear out the floor. Anything which is fit for animal food. but your local animals, beasts or bird can eat them. Metaltalin oto b'Shabbat can be moved on the Shabbos. Ketzad, what does that mean? Metaltalin et haturmos hayavesh. Dry turmos bean. It was a very tough bean. You can move it on the Shabbos because it could be eaten by goats. Avalo et halach, but not the moist turmos beans. Et hechatzav, you can move chatzav. According to most commentators, this is a plant called drimia. It grows very tall, and the roots go very deep into the ground. It's eaten by deer. Et hachardal, you can move mustard seed, because doves eat it. Et ha'atzamot, you can move bones, because dogs eat them. Similarly, any peels or any seed which could be eaten by an animal can be moved on the Shabbos. If they're not fit for animal consumption, you eat what you can eat, throw the rest away, and you cannot move it. You can move spoiled meat because some beasts will eat it. You can move raw meat, bein tafil, bein maliach, whether it's salted or unsalted, because technically it's fit for human consumption. V'chein dag maliach, and also salted fish can be moved, but unsalted fish, asur l'taltalo, is forbidden to move it, for it's unfit for both human and animal consumption. It's raw fish, nobody's going to eat it. Halacha Yud Zayin ein metaltalin shivrei zchuchit. A person cannot move broken pieces of glass, afal pisha in ma'achal na'amiyot, even though technically they can be consumed by ostriches. V'lo chavilei zmorot, nor can you move bundles of vines, afal pisha in ma'achal lepilim, even though elephants can eat them. V'lo et haluf, neither can you move certain type of onion, afal pisha in ma'achal le'orvim, even though ravens will eat them. Mipnei she'ein elu v'chayotzei bahen mitzuyin etzal rov b'nei adam, because these animals aren't typically found amongst people. Remember in Halacha Ted Zayin, he said, it has to be fit for an animal which is hamitzuyin, which is commonly found near you. These animals are more found in the wild. Halacha Yudchet, chabilei kash v'chabilei zradim, bundles of straw and bundles of twigs. Some add in here, chavilei etzim, bundles of wood also. If you prepare them for animal food, you can move them. If not, you cannot move them on the Shabbos. Chavilei si'ah, pu'ah, ve'ezov, ve'koranit. Bundles of different types of plants. They identify it over here as some wild hyssop, nadder root, makes red dye, other hyssop, and thyme, they say is koranit over here. Earlier, when it came to koranit, they didn't translate it. There's different opinions on what they mean. These herbs, if you gather them in to be used as firewood, you cannot use them on Shabbos. But if you took them out for animal food, then you can use them on the Shabbos. The same applies to mint and to rue. Two types of little plants. Mint on the left, rue is on the right. Any other spices, the same rules apply. You can only use them on Shabbos if they were intended to be used for animal food. Halacha Yutet ein gorfin ma'achal milifnei patam. If you have a patam is an ox that's purposely being fattened. You cannot rake away food from in front of it. Bein ba'evus shel kli, bein ba'evus shel karka. Whether the trough is in a vessel, whether it's a trough in the ground. Ve'ein misalkin litzvadav mipnei hara'i. Neither can you move stuff aside in front of this animal because it's creating feces or whatever. Because of a decree, you might come to level out the ground. What you could do though is you can move food from in front of a donkey to an ox. But you cannot take from an ox and put it in front of a donkey. The ox would mix its saliva and its drool into its food. And no other animal will eat it. Commentaries say other oxen will. You can move from ox to ox, but not from ox to any other animal. If you have leaves who smell bad and they're disgusting, and even an animal wouldn't eat them, you cannot move them on the Shabbos. Therefore, a hook of fish cannot be moved, but a hook of meat, where meat is usually hung, mutar, that is permitted, it doesn't get super disgusting. And the same applies to anything else in similar situations. And now that Rambam deals with dead bodies, laws relating to a corpse, from here till the end of the chapter. Even though we cannot move a corpse on Shabbos, we should anoint him, and we may wash him, so long as we don't move any limbs. We can also take out a pillow from under his head, so he should be on the sand or on the ground, so his body should stop decomposing, it won't get that smelly. Umiviyin klei mekar, uklei matchot. We can bring vessels that will cool his body down, vessels of metal. Umanichin lo al kreso kadesh lo yitpach, and we put it on his stomach so it shouldn't bloat. Upokekinet nikavav. We can stuff any orifices, any holes in the person's body. We can stuff them closed. Shalo yikanes bahen haruach, so the air shouldn't get in. The koshinet halechi, we can tie down his jaw. Lo sheyaleh ela shalo yosif. Not that it should close, but that it shouldn't open more than it already is. We cannot shut the eyes of a dead body on Shabbos. I should point out, the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch says that based on the Zohar, today the custom is to close the eyes of a corpse and to straighten its limbs even on Shabbos, because otherwise there's sakana involved. The Zohar says it could lead to danger, so we do whatever we have to do on the Shabbos. Halacha chaf aleph met hamutal b'chama, if there's a dead body lying in the sun. Maniach alav kikar o tinok umetaltelo. Here you can put a loaf or a baby next to it and then carry it. Remember yesterday we saw that if you have something permitted and something forbidden to move, you cannot, if your main goal is the forbidden thing, you cannot move it by virtue of a permitted thing. But over here with the corpse you could, since it's sitting in the sun. Same thing if there's a fire in a courtyard which has a dead body, you can put a child or a loaf of bread on the dead corpse and move them both. If there isn't a loaf or there isn't a baby, save the corpse anyways. Otherwise a person may come to extinguish it. He doesn't want his relative to burn. He's going to be worried about his dead relative, that he shouldn't get burnt up. The only time the sages allow you to move something by virtue of a baby or a loaf of bread is by a dead body, because a person is distraught over his dead relatives. You have a corpse sitting in the sun and there's nowhere to move him. Or they didn't want to move him from his place. We can do a trick. Have two people come and sit on his two sides. They're in the sun. It's going to get hot under them. So each one will bring a little mat or a little bed to sit on. Now they're not going to be hot. But they're going to get hot from the top. Let each one bring a mat and put it over their heads to protect him. Now, once they have this bed mat contraption in place, let each one pick up the bed so that it's now on the side and their mat can lean over the beds and walk away. Now you have a partition that's been constructed on its own. Because the two mats, the tops, will be attached to each other. And the two edges will be on the ground on the two sides of the dead body. And now you've created a mechitza for the dead body to protect it on the Shabbos from the sun. If you have a dead body that's becoming very smelly in the home, it's getting embarrassed, disgraced among the living people, and the living people are getting embarrassed because of the dead body's smell. You could even take it out to a karmelit. You can carry on the Shabbos to a karmelit, not that public domain, but if the corpse is getting very smelly. Gadol kavod abriot, because human dignity is so great, that it will push off even a biblical negative commandment, the commandment to listen to the sages. Shahu, which is lo tasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yaminu smol. We're not allowed to stray from whatever the sages tell us, right or left, but over here we could. But if there was somewhere else for the people to go away to, and you don't have to move the dead body, do not take the dead body out, rather leave the dead body inside. So you don't have to transgress the sage's prohibition of Muktzeh and let the people go out to another place where they don't have to be disgraced by the dead body.